Okay, this week we're going to be looking at international trade and economy. And as I've mentioned before, international relations is not necessarily concerned with specific policies, but more of a broad overview of how nation states interact with each other, and in this case, at the economic level. We call this international political economy, and that is the focus of most IR study. How states interact on an economic level, as well as the positives and negatives that comes from this interaction, as well as the types of economies that we find in the world today. First, let's look at types of economies. The first type mentioned in your book is mercantilism. And in the IR world, this is often associated with realist theory. A purely classical real estate might be a mercantile estate. Why? This is where a state looks after its own self-interest. A state's position is therefore measured relative to another state. A state is powerful economically, militarily, etc., based upon how it relates to another state. How many missiles it has, how much money it may have in reserve, and so on. A mercantilist economy does not depend on organization. So unlike liberal economies, we're going to hear about in just a minute, mercantilist economies tend to avoid being part of multinational organizations or transnational organizations. Mercantilists also develop their own markets, their own resources, and produce their own products. They are essentially self-sufficient economies. We don't see a lot of these types of economies today, but they're usually associated with empires of the past, such as the British Empire, or isolated states, such as Cuba in the past, and perhaps North Korea today would be seen as a mercantilist economy. It is a self-contained economy. It tries to produce its own goods, and its market is solely within its own borders. Now, we know the mercantilist economy today doesn't work out too well because, of course, North Korea has to import certain goods, such as food. It can't really feed itself. It doesn't work out too well in the modern world. But in the past, usually associated with empires that had colonies, colonial holdings, mercantilist economies were quite frequent. But today, we tend to look at liberal economies as being the most important and part of liberal theory. Liberal economies, they see the importance of international cooperation for the betterment of all societies and meeting the needs of domestic consumption. It matters little if one state gains more than another. It matters only that the state gains, and international organizations are very important. So in the liberal economies, of which the United States is one, as well as Western Europe, Eastern Europe, China is also a liberal economy, even though it's a communist country. They're not necessarily concerned with relative gains, but they're concerned with gains made by the state itself. And as long as the state makes gains, then everybody wins. International organizations are very important. The World Trade Organization, regional economic organizations like the Asian Pacific Economic Community, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Union. These organizations are populated by liberal economies, economies that are seeking trade and are seeking to maximize their benefit in the world economy. In liberal economies, it is frequent that you have hegemonic states. Hegemonic states are not looked upon negatively. Hegemonic states are seen as benign and necessary to maintain safe conditions for trade. It's one of the reasons why the United States has been so successful in recent decades, because it is seen by many as a benign hegemon. It is called upon to keep the sea lanes open. It is called upon to keep the free flow of oil ongoing to these economies in the rest of the world. Many people believe China is becoming a regional and soon a global hegemon, not to be feared, but to be credited with creating safe conditions for trade for everybody involved. Whether that's true or not, of course, remains to be seen. Liberals also look fondly upon globalization, and here we'll take a little turn from the lecture and go right into a little detailed discussion of globalization. What is it? You've all heard the term. There are many definitions for globalization depending on which textbook you look at. I'm just going to present one variety here. Globalization describes an ongoing process by which regional economies, societies, and cultures have become integrated through a global spanning network of communication and execution. Describes an ongoing process by which regional economies, societies, and cultures have become integrated through a globe-spanning network of communication and execution. Well, execution here, I'm not talking about something negative. We're meaning the carrying out of certain policies and certain trade activities. Regional economies, economies like the United States, like the UK, like France, like Russia, like China, like Japan, like South Korea, they are no longer simply trading with other regional economies, but have intertwined, interlinked their successes and their failures with economies around the globe. And not only has globalization brought about economic integration, but cultural integration as well. Think about the idea of soft power. Many of you are writing your paper on American soft power. You're looking at how American cultural influences have spread across the globe and built a common cultural bond with other nation states. We see this with Japanese culture. We see this with the K-pop phenomenon coming out of South Korea, with the Confucian Institutes around the world sponsored by the Chinese government. All of this is part of globalization. In terms of the dimensions of globalization, of course, there is a historical impetus for globalization. I'll put some of them up here. Okay, get them all up on the board. Is globalization essentially a modern phenomenon? Some say yes, after the Second World War is truly when the world became globalized. Some say no. They'll point to previous civilizations and the interconnectedness that exists. For example, the Indus Valley, the Nile River, the Yellow River civilizations. We find evidence of trade between these peoples, even in the ancient world. Even 5,000 years ago, we find coins, we find pottery shards, we find even the mummified bodies of certain individuals in these cultures that showed they did in fact know of each other and in fact traded with each other over a period of time. And since these river civilizations represented the first true economies of the ancient world, it can be said that they were globalized to a certain extent. Later, Rome and China would also share economic benefits with each other on a small scale, but still nonetheless one that existed via the Silk Road. When the Mongol Empire conquered the largest land empire ever, it allowed for the kind of cultural and economic integration and sharing between the East and the West that had never existed before. And of course, you all know the Age of Discovery, led by the discoveries of Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and others of Western Europe, as well as the voyages of Zheng He of China, lead to what we call the Age of Discovery and Colonization, where European powers and later the Americans would colonize much of the world from East and Southeast Asia and Africa and the Middle East. And of course, this created a certain kind of order in the world that allowed and facilitated for globalization. The East India Company, of course, growing out of this, European integration as well growing out of this. So certainly we can point to historical examples where globalization existed in the past. But for those who want to focus on the modern era, they say that modern globalization really begins after the Second World War, spurred on by the interest in decreasing future wars. Now, this is where we have to give the United States quite a bit of credit. The United States creates the United Nations, creates the Bretton Woods system, creates the IMF and the World Bank, believing that tying economies together, tying the economies of Germany and France together, will lead to a decrease in war. When people share a common interest, when they share a common economic interest, they tend not to fight each other because both will lose. This is one of the great calculations going into the creation of the United Nations, going into the creation of the European community, later the European Union. And this is the same kind of thinking that spurs the creation of groups like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and linking the economies of Southeast Asia together to build cultural bonds, to build financial bonds, to build economic bonds between nation states, and making it, in theory at least, less likely to fight, less likely to have war, less likely to have confrontation. And so far, it seems to be true. So when we talk about modern globalization, we're talking about the linking of these economies after the Second World War, the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, leading to the creation of the World Trade Organization. These are monumental steps in global international economy, linking each step, linking nation states together further and further and deeper in terms of economics. All right, measuring globalization. It's hard to measure certain kinds of integration. Political and social integration tend to be the hardest to measure. It's hard to quantify the level of political integration, for example, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Even though they're all very transparent in terms of their politics, it's hard to measure social integration as well. Economic integration, and therefore globalization, is a bit easier to see. For example, we can look at the level of exports and imports between nation states. We can look at the level of exports and imports as a percent of GDP. We can look at migration rates. We can look at something called the brain drain in less developed world countries, where their best and brightest are coming to the developed world and getting involved in the economic process. We can look at graduation rates. We can look at capital flows, the flow of capital in a particular country and the flow out of capital from a particular country. This tells us a lot about the success and failures of economic policy. We can look at the level of technology, the amount of money and the amount of people and the amount of time that's being invested in international research and development centers and the flows of technology from one economy to the other. These things are easily measured, and we do it often. And they tell us really the level of integration that's taking place around the world today. The effects of globalization, of course, globalization has many effects. And it has affected the world in many different ways. Just two I want to mention here: industrial and financial. The emergence of a worldwide market and the emergence of the worldwide industrial base, broader access to foreign goods, broader access to markets, consumers, and companies. Think about when you go shopping for a car, when you go shopping for a phone, when you go shopping even for food in your supermarket. Think about the variety of choices that you have today brought to you by globalization. It's an amazing thing. Just years ago, we'd go to the supermarket, finding something like mangoes or something like rambutan, these tropical fruits coming from Malaysia and other parts of the world, would have been unthinkable, and now they're commonplace. You want to buy a car in the 1980s, what are your choices? Ford, Pontiac, various General Motors products, and you can think of the other ones as well, Mercury. All of these products that we had availability to in the 1980s were all more or less American-built American cars, Detroit-centered cars. Yes, you had a few Japanese models, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, but even that's a result of globalization in the 70s and 80s. But go car shopping today in America. How many choices do you have? Oh my goodness. Everything from German cars, Swedish cars, Korean cars, Chinese cars, Italian cars, and of course American cars. You name it, the choice is tremendous. And this is a result of globalization. The availability of choice, new consumer products. I've seen this happen even in China during my visits to China, starting in the early 1990s, leading up even until I was in China just a couple of weeks ago, and seeing how their market economy has truly transformed their consumerism. Now they have at their disposal goods from around the world that did not exist even 10 years ago in their markets. Financial also, the emergence of worldwide financial markets, better access to financing, better access to borrowers, better access to investment. Some of you might be invested and have an investment portfolio where you're investing in international companies, maybe in places like Southeast Asia, China, Africa, wherever it may be. This is just part of the effects of globalization. The realization of a global common market based upon the freedom of exchanges of goods and capital, also part of the effects of globalization. Health policy, we're seeing with the Ebola scare how healthcare and the effects of disease, given the ease of transportation due to globalization, is becoming a big priority in the world today. And political. Some use globalization as a means of creation of a world government which regulates relationships and guarantees the rights from social to economic globalization. Indeed, we are seeing more and more of a trend towards the political in globalization. All right, I've reached the 15-minute mark. Let me stop here. I'll pick it up in just a moment.